Welcome to Season 2, Episode 4 of A Story Club, Global Politics and Cultures, brought to you by Bulletproof Podcast Formula. My name is Dr. Kirk Megu, and I'm the Public Relations Officer of the United National Congress, the official opposition party in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. This is a unique venture, streaming simultaneously from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, Dehra Dun in India, and San Francisco in the United States. We speak with people around the world, trying to understand different issues and problems relevant to my own country, Trinidad and Tobago, but also to people in sometimes very similar and sometimes very different situations or cultures or histories, politics, sociology, etc. The goal is to learn from each other, to build networks, to widen our perspectives, and to work for solutions in our distinctive context. Today's episode is entitled Constitutions and Elections in Multi-Ethnic Societies, Mauritius and Trinidad and Tobago. Mauritius, just to give you a little bit of an introduction, Mauritius and Trinidad and Tobago are almost on exact opposite sides of the world. Mauritius in the southern hemisphere, close to Africa, about 15 degrees down, 60 degrees latitude east, and Trinidad 60 degrees latitude west, about 10 degrees up. It's almost exactly across, but we are so similar. Small island states that were once sugar plantations in the British Empire, but initially with French settlers. Then after taken over by the British, Indian indenture was brought in, Chinese indentured laborers. It is an incredible similarity. They're a small island of 1.3 million in Mauritius, same thing in Trinidad. The mixture is almost the same. We were under the same British colonizers. Trinidad and Tobago got independence in 62, Mauritius in 68. But within those 6 years different, the constitutions that the British left us with were very radically different. In Trinidad and Tobago, they were totally against proportional representation or communal representation, which are two separate things. Later on, just as an interim, Guyana, which is also a similar country, they weren't granted independence unless they had proportional representation, very different from us. Then in Mauritius, they have this totally different system. 3 past the post, not first past the post like us or the UK. They have this system called the best loser system, which accounts for the communal representation. It's a very, very fascinating difference, and it's interesting to compare our experiences, how they have been similar, how they have been different. And I'm fortunate to be joined by distinguished guests from Trinidad and Tobago and from Mauritius. We have our first guest is Jean-Marie Richard. He's a principal consultant and CEO of Imagine Communications in Mauritius. He deals with government and corporate clients in Africa and the Indian Ocean, particularly. And he's worked as a communications and media consultant for the Ministry of Rodrigues in the Government of Mauritius, which we'll talk about later. It's similar to the Tobago-Trinidad situation. Then from Trinidad, we have Timothy Hamel-Smith. He's Partner Emeritus at Hamel-Smith, a law firm that has existed for over 110 years in Trinidad and Tobago. Hardly anything has existed for 110 years in Trinidad. That's quite amazing. He is also a former president of the Senate with a very notable political pedigree, which we may get into later. Welcome, gentlemen.
Great to be with you, Kirk. Thanks for inviting us.
Welcome. Namaskar.
Yes.
Comment ça va, tout le monde? Kirk, it's nice to be nicely and nice and honored to be in Brussels.
Yes, a pleasure to have you here. You know, with your multilingual introduction there, we can talk about some of the historical things, because Trinidad used to be much more multilingual before. People used to be speaking Hindi, Tamil, in fact, French, Spanish. These used to be much more widely spoken in Trinidad. We still have the legacy words in our vocabulary and in our Creole, but it's a very, very interesting comparison. So let me start by asking you all individually. to give our audience a little bit more idea about yourself and what your interest in constitutional matters in Trinidad, in Mauritius, and maybe beyond. What exactly is your interest? Why you find it interesting? How you got interested in being involved in the topic, and what involvement you may have had. So let me start off with Jean-Marie from Mauritius, and then Timothy after. Jean-Marie?
Okay, I am voluntarily designated, so I don't think I have a choice. My initial training is a first degree in law, and then I digress to many other things, including defense and strategic studies, European institutions, political science, and obviously journalism and communication. I think we belong to a generation where our consciousness arose during the heated debate over our country becoming an independent and sovereign state. Obviously, we had quite radical views on the matter, and to be more precise, the French settlers didn't come alone. They brought in slaves from mainly Madagascar. The Dutch occupation brought some Malays who transited to go to the Cape, and also from some parts, the French, some parts of Mozambique and Western Africa. This was for historical precision. And when the slave trade was abolished in 1835, implemented in 1838 or 39, Indian indentured, mainly from the counters, French settlers brought in slaves from Chandanago in Bengal, and obviously Pondicherry, now Puducherry in the south, and some people from the Southeast Asia. That was the French, and the English started a massive, on the request of the slave owners, who were prompt in requesting a compensation for the loss of their slaves and their free labor. And all this was quite a melting pot, and started arising and being aroused since 1936 under both the influence of the English Fabian Society, which would then lead to the Labour Party, and the consciousness move of Mahatma Gandhi, which started in India. When he stopped in Mauritius, on his way back he started in South Africa. When he was back in Mauritius after his South African stay back home in India, he sent some figures like Manil Doctor, who are the founder figures, iconic founder figures, who triggered the need for education, the need for consciousness, the need for launch the IS March and the need to preserve culture and heritage. So this is the melting pot which we had back since the 30s through up to 48 and 58 general elections, which were universal one man, one vote elections, paving the way to independence, and where negotiations, the question of proportional representation was put by the British, but refused by all. Reservations were expressed in such a way, but it was discarded, and we have we are left with the best closure systems, on which I'll be glad to elaborate afterwards.
All right, okay. Thanks a lot. And Timothy, a bit about your background and interest in constitutional matters in Trinidad.
All right. So thank you, Jean-Marie. That was very interesting, noting that history. My father was a politician. So if you go back to the 50s, he would have been the Labour Party there at the time in the 50s. And perhaps it gets into your DNA, I'm not sure. But I got first interested in politics in 1981. I was with the ONR, the Organization for National. And one of the surprising things about the ONR is that whilst it's won about 22% of the popular vote, it got no seats at all, which is why I'm very interested to hear from Mauritius' point of view, the extent to which there is representation. Because I think that certainly, if you're going to have a democracy, then certainly, we have a representative democracy. And if you have 22% of your voters left out of representation altogether, then in fact, from my personal perspective, there's something flawed about the system. So we're under the first past the post system. We gained independence in 1962. Prior to that, from 56, we were self-governing. And of course, yes, we, like yourself, we had emerged from a colonial British setup when they took over in Trinidad and Tobago. So my father would have been involved in electoral politics, and I had even though I was young at the time, there was a flavor of it. In 81, I took a far more intensive sort of interaction in the politics. And that was one of the things that stood out for me, that you wonder if in fact the system could be right, or perhaps the system is right and there are other issues wrong with it. It just didn't seem to me that a 20%, over plus 20% part of the population could be unrepresented, and yet you could call it democracy. Thereafter, I had not, strangely enough, been part of the NAR, which came in 86, which was after the ONR. But what you do find is the same thing happened in the NAR won, a landslide victory, if you recall, with 30 seats here to the PNM's 3. It was a real whitewash. It was, we haven't seen anything like that since in our history. And it was a very lopsided victory in that sense. But it's interesting to note, in 1991, when the PNM won the election again, having lost it in 86, the NAR, as it was then constituted, really was what I would call a rump of the ONR, because NAR really consisted of 3 political parties that had combined. the ONR, the ULF, and the DAC in Tobago. And if you look at the voting, again, you find in 91, they captured 23% of the vote. A lot of people don't realize that because there were no seats once. Well, there were 2 seats because the 2 Tobago seats stayed with A&R Robinson. So, in Trinidad and Tobago, in Trinidad in particular, of course, Trinidad and Tobago are made up of 2 islands, I should mention, so that makes us somewhat different. And in Trinidad, there was more than 20% of the popular vote in Trinidad had been won, but no seats. And then you got that repeated again in 2007 when Mr. Dukaran had emerged with the next party. And what you find, of course, is that people get disenchanted with the voting process if, in fact, you can't get representation. And the question, therefore, it raises for me questions relating to how good the system works. It's either, to my mind, one of 2 things. If you look at the first past the post system in New Zealand, in Australia, in the UK, in Canada, in India, you will find that third parties, having as small as 2% or 5% or 6% winning seats in parliament. But I've never seen anywhere that I have looked at where you've won by more, you have over 20% of the popular vote, but 0 seats. I haven't seen that anywhere under the first past the post system. And yet, we take it for granted that, well, that's how it is. And first past the post is if it's good for the UK, it's good for us. But in fact, that's not how it works in the UK or in New Zealand or in Australia or in Canada or in India, where you find, small parties can still win votes. There is, to my mind, something skewed about it. And therefore, there begins my perspective of saying one needs to revisit the Constitution to see how best representation can take place. Because ultimately, your elections, what you want to do is for the best talent to emerge through your parliament to represent your country and therefore hopefully take it to bigger and better heights than it has been in the past. And I mean, to my mind, that's what politics is about. Transformation of the country and, ensuring that you have prosperity for all at the end of the day. And that's at the heart of it. And how do we achieve that? Through the electoral process, I think it's certainly my focus in terms of what I think we need to look at.
Right. Well, that's interesting. There are a lot of things that that overlap that I would like to highlight and maybe get Jean-Marie to comment on, and then yourself after, Timothy. But from both of your contributions just now, I'll point out some similarities, because there are so many similarities, both sociologically, institutionally, maybe very differently. But you talked about the NAR in 1986 with the wipeout, and that notably happened after 30 years of single party rule. And so there's this coalition after so many years of trying and failing, and then the same thing happened in Mauritius in 1983, where you had one party in power for, I can't remember if it was 30 years, but very close, could be 25 years. And then you had this coalition trying to break through the old ethnic voting again. And they had, well, 60-0, it was 60-0. It was a total wipeout again. Same type of thing, very interesting. And the ethnic question had raised its head there because the opposition, even though they had larger numbers, felt that the Indian majority should still retain the nominal leadership. Just like in Trinidad, the Indian minority felt that the Afro-Creole majority should have the face of leadership in a certain, it's fascinating that. But the politics of coalition is very different between Mauritius and Trinidad. Coalitions are normal and part of the process. And maybe that's one thing Jean-Marie could talk about. The 3 past the post system is fascinating. Each voter in Mauritius, in each constituency, you have 3 representatives, not just 1. They could be 3 from the same party. They could be 3 from different parties, but you vote for 3 representatives in your area, not just 1. They also have Rodrigues, which is a small island that actually used the THA model as something to guide devolution there, which was interesting. And I know Jean-Marie worked closely with that. And then the whole question of racial and ethnic voting and how we deal with that. Is it that we ignore it? Do we try to account for it and give balance? That's what the whole best loser system is about in Mauritius. And how does you talked about Timothy, 3 times a party got more than 20% of the vote in Trinidad and got 0 seats, right? I don't know if that has happened in Mauritius because of the dynamic coalition situation. But I know there's a lot of things I raised there. You don't have to address all of them. Just address the ones that pique your interest most, Jean-Marie, and then we'll get back to Timothy.
Okay, I'll try to be as precise and short as possible. Firstly, I would say to Tim that we also have quite a heated debate on the representativity and representation of our parliamentary so-called Westminsterish type of democracy, where there is, because of the first past the post system, even if you have 3 representatives, more or less elected or chosen by the parties with their ethno-political pedigree or background. This also is interesting. There's lots of understatements. This is what I think we have more nurtured from the British legacy. So 3 plus opposed, 3 on mainland Mauritius, and only 2 at the time of independence on the island of Rodrigues, which ethnic pattern is more Afro-Creole than in Mauritius, where in Mauritius we have more of an Indo-Asian Muslim prevalence for historical reasons. This also began, and there is some sort of line of divide between those 2 communities, and within the Hindu community, there has been in the last 40 years quite some lines of divide of different origins of our people coming from India. This is very fascinating. Nobody talks about it. Everybody uses it. All the calculation is made through the grid of what is called scientific communalism since the 70s, which was really taken to task by the radical movement of the leftist party led by inter alia Paul Béranger, Dave Virasomi, Kader Bayat, and all these gang. And they made a statement in 1971 by presenting a Telugu in a Vaishya-dominated country where the Dr. Ramgulam Siusaka, the father, had been continuously elected easily, and he had a landslide victory in a by-election, and this triggered all the tension, repression, and the consciousness from which is also my background as from 1975, when we had some student protests, but those were the days. Which I do not at all deny and renounce. I think the ideals are the same. So, Tim, for the issue of representation, we have this issue. There has been some move in the sense that as an electoral citizen of the Republic of Mauritius, which are not known as Mauritians per se, the electoral laws of Mauritius provide for a Hindu community, religious, a Muslim community, religious, a Chinese community, ethnic, and what is not all of these three becomes what is called a general population, which again, we could say, but if we have general population, there must be some specific populations. But the qualification of the specific populations are themselves based on not the level playing ground of qualification. Now, since a few years ago, a more contemporary, and this has been defined in the Lancaster talks held in the UK in 1955, where the Mauritians actually, we just lost the last of the totems of this conference in the person of late former Prime Minister and President Anirudh Jugnauth, whose contribution I think we'll have to talk about it later, but a more radical, contemporary, and more global citizenship, alternative, non-ethno geared, at least in publicly, more Creole language and Creole, not as a group within the general population, because the general population you have Creoles, mulattoes, white plantocrats, small whites, Indo-Creoles, mixtures, and it's just a sort of magma. So this, which is with this organization, which is called Resistance and Alternatives rather, put a case and refused to declare their ethnicity, which was an obligation in our electoral law, so as to incapacitate the Electoral Commission to make the calculations regarding this best loser system, which ensures representativities of different ethno-political religious groups, mainly minorities. So this system was quite interestingly, how would I say, avoided, because everybody knows that in the first place, the general population, basically the Creoles, whatever be their shade of gray, are in certain constituencies. Here also it raises the gerrymandering. You must be familiar with the term in Trinidad. The delimitation of constituencies, which is quite deliberate regarding, history, townships and everything. Somebody of Chinese origin, so basically not Chinese, he inscribed his community as being to be general population in a constituency where normally there are quite a number of general population who are voters. He was enlisted by a party, Mauritius Social Democratic Party, which history now has noted was at the time of independence dead against independence, but then started 2 years after independence, 1 year after independence, linked in a coalition which was the first step of the setting of a base of our political culture. They were also part of certain forms of not coalition, but representation of different sensitivities, political, more or less ethno-based or religious based, the party, Mauritius Social Democratic Party. And he finished in 2014 or 2010, more precisely, in 4th position, but as he has registered as a general population ethnic candidate, he was returned to parliament. So this was the kickstart of the increasing momentum of, hey guys, what is this all about? And he was obviously, that is the end of the cycle, appointed minister to government because he was a Chinese. So to ensure everybody on boardism, which is another specific characteristic of Mauritius politics, Mauritian politics.
Can I intervene at this point, Jean-Marie? Just to get some comment from Timothy, and I'll explain a little both for Timothy and the wider the audience for some of the details that you were giving, which are very fascinating. But the best loser system is very interesting. It's designed, it's a complicated system where after the voting is done, what they do is they look at the ethnic composition of the parliament and they see how close it is to the census. So you look at the amount of Creoles, which is the word they use, or general population, Muslims, Chinese, Hindus, and if it is out of whack, then what they do is they have this complicated system where they choose the best losers in the election, and they have to be also from the same party. So in other words, the ethnic composition will change and become more like the census, but the party representation is like the voting, right? So it's a very complicated system. But they had this concern that the parliament should ethnically reflect the census, and so they developed that system, right? And in Trinidad we don't have anything like that, and so there's a lot of controversies in Mauritius, as Jean-Marie was talking about. Some people didn't even want to give off their ethnicity to participate in that system. And another interesting thing Jean-Marie was talking about, that even when you have these formal systems, like in the Hindus, there's a divide between the Tamils, the Telugus, which is the North Indians and the South Indians. which is not formally recognized. And just like kind of how in Trinidad, people informally talk about the Indian vote, but there is a strong divide between the Presbyterians, the Hindus, and the Muslims. So these are interesting things from that perspective there. But I don't know if there's any issues you want to take off on there from listening to Jean-Marie and this explanation. Tim, I'll hand it to you.
That was very interesting, Jean-Marie. What I would be interested to know is whether, in fact, having a system like that, does it cause more or less racial tension? Do the people get along with each other, basically, and therefore are prepared to follow a single vision in order to accomplish whatever mission the government may set out to be? So that, to me, tells the question of, are you effective or not? Whatever the system might be, if in fact the reverse happens, it creates tension, it creates animosity between different either religious or ethnic groups, and it doesn't allow for a single vision, but at least a critical mass of people, then I would say the system isn't doing what I think it ought to do. So that's one aspect, and I would like to hear from Jean-Marie on that. There is another aspect worth looking at in the context of what I was speaking earlier. If you look back at Tobago, now Tobago is a fairly homogeneous nation. I don't know what the percentages are, but I'm sure it's over 90% Afro-Trinidadian. And you got this, if you remember, a few years back, you got, when they were voting for the THA, and you had 12 seats. What you found is that one party, the TOP, won 39% of the vote, but no seats. And the PNM won 60% of the popular vote and got all 12 seats. And it was literally an embarrassment. Everybody was wondering, well, how are we going to get somebody to be an opposition, or else you have a one-party state? That's really but what is amazing about that percentage? So we will be talking about over 20%, 23% throughout the whole of Trinidad and Tobago. But there in Tobago itself, 39%. I mean, surely that is beyond what should be acceptable by any measure. But more than that, what you find in Tobago, that over 60% of your population work for the THA. So if I control the THA, then I control who works with me. And then you're left out, not only out of representation, you are omitted, if you like. So you're not only disenfranchised, but your ability to get work diminishes substantially. And nobody, of course, we now have that move because recently, instead of getting a 39%, now you have a 50-50 with a deadlock. And the way that the government are seeking to end that deadlock is in fact by creating more seats. But one would have thought, and it would be to the advantage of the government at the moment, if you had a PR system. So I got the percentage of, I got my constituency representative for every district in which I won, but I also get a number of seats that equated with the percentage of the popular vote. And whilst the popular vote was close, the PNM won more of the popular vote and therefore would have had the right to appoint the secretary of the THA, and they would have had executive control. And I felt that was a better resolution to look for. But of course, for the PNM, I think you find that a proportional representation is a dagger pointed at the heart of the PNM, is how they perceive that. What the other interesting thing I think to hear from Jean-Marie, relates to how well do coalitions work? Are they stable in the sense that do they last the entire electoral term? And do they work together, or are there the coalitions that are in government, do they tend to be fractious and disagreeable, or do they actually meld and follow a particular policy? I would love to hear more about how that works in Mauritius.
Yes, Jean-Marie. So yes, about the
Yes,
kind of communal
I
policy.
will start with the last. I will start with the last question. No, coalitions do not last. And there's always speculation, more or less ethno-political based. And even if coalitions come forward with a program or a manifesto is barely read, first of all. And secondly, provided for at the last minute. And interestingly, political parties do not have a legal status or a legal personality, to use a judicial term. They are registered to the electoral commission within the framework provided by law. So no, they don't work. And currently, in terms of representativity and representation, we do have, because there was no coalition, we do have a minority government in as far as the popular vote is concerned, with 37%, which is governing the country with a quite comfortable majority of at least 8 to 10 MPs, if my memory is good. And the opposition parties, which couldn't come to a deal, represent 63% of the popular vote and have less than 25% of parliament representation. So the question of PR in whatever formula is acute. And I was mentioning the resistance and alternative contestation. This went up to the United Nations Judicial Council Court, which summoned the Mauritian government to stop requesting the mandatory reference to ethnicity in the electoral enlistment. And Kurt, to answer your initial question, the census figures are go back to the 1972, the latest official census, and all following censuses, you are not obliged, and they are not taken into account. They are not taking into account your ethno-communal religious background. If you refuse, it is to the canvasser to
assigned
to guess, which is what happened in Trinidad. No, actually, I think people are allowed to just self-identify. Yeah, but sometimes people will just write. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and Kirk and Tim, if I'm considered in Mauritius as a general population, but I vote in Rodrigues for general and regional elections, so it's a different case figure. But if I wished, I could describe my lifestyle as a Chinese or a Muslim or Hindu. Nobody prevents me from doing this.
So you are categorized as general population, but you are so mixed that you can say Hindu or Chinese, and it would be acceptable.
No, I can say I'm Chinese or Hindu by my lifestyle.
By your lifestyle, okay. So it's flexible on how you want to self-identify.
Exactly.
Okay. I want to ask you something again from what Tim was talking about, and ask you your opinion. Because I mean I'm very familiar with Mauritius because my wife is from there, and I've been there many times and so forth, and I've studied the system quite a bit. But Tim asked an important question about whether this system, where they are very concerned about the balance of the parliament reflecting the consensus, whether this promotes social unity. There are very differing views on that. And I think it comes from your type of perspective, because people are very attached to their ancestral heritage. But, and I think that is undeniable. On the other hand, I also think in Mauritius, they have a sense of national purpose and direction in a way that we don't in Trinidad. You know, when they talk about economic diversification or fighting coronavirus or these sorts of national development plans, even something like reworking the whole water system. I remember I was there one year and they went into everybody's house, into all the roads. I think this could never happen in Trinidad. People would not allow that type of thing. From my perspective as an outsider looking at Mauritius in that respect, I do see, you know, in terms of the planning and the communication and the way they bring people on board, there is this national ability to work together for a common purpose, which has reflected in some amazing development statistics and so forth in Mauritius, while at the same time clinging on to ancestral traditions, languages, and these sorts of things at the cultural level. That's been my observation. I don't know if you agree with that in Mauritius.
Now, you're right in your observation regarding the ability to put our heads together and because it's a question of survival. Yeah. We have no hinterland, less than 5 days shipping, or 4 hours if we consider Africa our hinterland, 4 hours, and in India and the Middle East 6 hours. So no hinterland. And this tone was actually given by the 1969 coalition. Yeah. The 1967 election were really, I remember I was 8 or 9, were really bitter and went just along before the independence. Lines. Yeah. 1 year before
independence. It's like in 61 in Trinidad, very bitter.
The determination of independence following the elections and the Party of Independence, which was in fact a coalition of the Muslim Community Action Party, the Independent Forward Bloc, who was a more Netaji Bose organization, but very higher Samajist, and which did great work in the early 19th century to the 30s, 60s. The Labour Party, which was the first party to talk of autodetermination, self-government, and workers' right in 1946 inception. So it was very bitter, but
and if I may intervene, just to, if I'm correct, and you could tell, a part of that bitterness was that the Creole party did not want independence, but the sort of Indian-based party wanted independence. Is that correct?
I was coming to this. The Asian-based party in majority were for independence, and the social democratic party which was financed by the sugar oligarchy and followed by the mixed Creole population of the general population, which actually provoked an exodus of this segment of the population. We were very minority of people who decided to stay, who made a choice to stay. This was the case of my family. This was not the case of my family on my mother's side, who most of them migrated to mainly Australia and the UK, and even strangely enough, South Africa. So that's part of our history. And also, what is quite interesting is that as from 1969, we entered a coalition, and then this coalition left a government coalition, which is a clear signal to the Western world, because we remember at this time we were right in the middle of a Cold War, and both the Independence Party and the Mauritian Social Democratic Party were very pro-West, mainly the latter. And this left a vacuum in which ideas about Mauritianity, nationalism, within the grid of people like Fanon, Gansky, Marxist, more or less, if we can say so, libertarian Marxists, leftists or radicals, and then this actually gave you to some political instability, consciousness of workers' rights, and to the creation of the Mauritian militant movement, which is today as offsprings in quite a large part of the political spectrum. And to come back to Tim, yes, there is latent, I would not say tension, but more schizophrenia. We have one side, this ability to pull ourselves together as a question of survival, but we are also always having innuendos about, yes, is it not an ethno-political bias? What if it were, and if it were, how should I react? And politicians, when we are campaigning, use it a lot. And I think this is in the DNA of quite a number of politicians. Then on their public speeches, they talk of national unity, one people, one nation, but in the underlying factors, you have targeted communal scientific meetings targeting some specific communities off before communities. The funny thing about the best loser system regarding its original inception of its thinkers is when a MP is designated as representative in his capacity of representative of a community in particular. Now it has been extended to a Hindu community for a casteist reason. The same MPs, when addressed or put the question, say, no, I'm the MP of all my constituents.
Right.
So this is quite funny, and I think it served a purpose, definitely, in the 60s and in this bitter tension, and also followed by ethno-communal riots which occurred just before independence. More a sort of, mafia, ethno-mafia tensions, which also provoked some ethnic migration within the country, from suburbs of Port-Louis to the uplands, from QP to the coastlands, for different motives. So it's fascinating as an experience, as a social experience. But my reading is that we are, for majority of us, schizophrenics who don't want to acknowledge this fact. But okay,
now,
we can survive.
Since we're coming to the end of the program, but I do want to bring Tim again to even answer your own question, because I know you pose these things about to Jean-Marie, but I'd like to hear your opinion about these questions of ethnicity, of race. Obviously, you've concentrated on the representation of parties, but what is your view to tell the international audience about Trinidad and Tobago in terms of ethnicity and politics, in terms of working together for a common cause or not? From someone who's been involved in the process, can you tell our international audience your perspective?
Sure. I mean, there's no doubt in our case that the two major parties, the PNM and the UNC, their base following is tribal, it's ethnic. And of course, but what you do find is that the two ethnic groupings that follow those parties are in fact diminishing, and the middle perhaps is growing more than those bases. So at some point in time, there's likely to be a transition, but at the moment, and therefore you get the same sort of dog whistles as Jean-Marie sort of hinted at in terms of when you do your campaigning. What I think Trinidad lacks in particular, because my own personal view is, in order to follow a national vision, you need to get at least a critical mass of people following that same vision. And you might put that critical mass at 66%, perhaps. I don't know exactly if you have a percentage, but if you don't get that critical mass, what happens in Trinidad is that whoever wins, and it may represent almost 50% of the vote, both parties right now in the last couple of elections are just a few seats apart from each other. So you find almost 50% are on one side, 50% on the other. And therefore, the intent of their followers is to go against whoever happens to be the government. And therefore, you never get that critical mass following a particular vision. Even right now, where you have a pandemic, where you would think that people would join together for the common good, because the virus knows no ethnicity or religion or color or creed. And you would think that people would join together, and yet you still get those tensions, rather than find that for the common good, we need to have a national front, if you like, in which we put forward a plan very, even on the question of, whether you campaign for people to take the vaccine. We can't even seem to get that on. And I mean, here was an opportunity. Trinidad is great in terms of its ability to in song and in theater, and therefore they have that ability in the entertainment field. If you use that should surely be a really wonderful way to pull people together behind at least a common vision of let's get vaccine. We all need to be saved. And yet you're not seeing that. And that, I think, is a real downfall. I don't know at what point we will transition to getting a critical mass so we could follow a common vision, or else you will continue to flounder, in my view. On the other hand, I do recognize and argue whether perhaps a coalition system where you have different interests being represented in a particular government might in fact produce something that no one party with its own ethnic base could achieve on its own. And as I say, I think the middle is growing. I think that 23% is going to climb upwards. And therefore, even if the system remains the same, I'm not in favor of it remaining the same. I do think that we have a flawed democracy. And we, at the heart of that is that the electoral system does not throw up the type of representation one ought to achieve, given the voting patterns that you've seen. But, you know, in time, I think that will happen. For the moment, it could happen more quickly if, in fact, you changed, I think, the electoral system. Either we need more constituencies, which would be one way of tackling the problem, or you need a mixed form of proportional representation, in my view, which, of course, since the Woodin Commission, 1973, has been advocated. And that was a powerful commission of a mixture of people, all of whom collectively came to the conclusion. But our Prime Minister at the time, Dr. Eric Williams, wouldn't have anything of it. I mean, from his perspective, that was intended to you know, be the death knell of the PNM. I think if it had been introduced in 1976, it would have perhaps taken us to a new place. Of course, one can ponder on these things. One could theoretically say it would be better, but you can't say with certainty because nobody knows what will emerge from a new system and how will people react. Will they, you know, but we do need that to get that critical mass of people supporting a single vision. Because my own perspective is that Trinidad has a lot of potential. I wouldn't be here if I didn't think it did. You know, I could be very satisfied without taking part in politics. But because I think that becomes a cornerstone of building Trinidad and Tobago, I think it's something we must continue to plant the seed. And hopefully at some point, it will grow and flourish and blossom for the benefit of all.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I do want to add that, I mean, you know, maybe some of the international listeners, when you talk about the lack of cooperation, they might think it's the opposition opposing for opposing's sake, but it's the opposition that has always been calling to work together, and the government, it's a government that has the recalcitrant attitude, funnily enough, and that's been sadly the attitude.
I like your term recalcitrant in that context.
Yes, which has a very local resonance. Yes.
But Jean-Marie mentioned that, you know, a term that of course had been just recently used by our president, that our people are what did she say, that we were schizophrenic?
Yes.
Didn't it resonate when Jean-Marie said that?
Yes. Right. Well, we are coming to the end of the program. It's been a very fascinating discussion. There's so many things to discuss about these issues and how to move forward. Let me invite Jean-Marie to give a last word on what he'd like to leave the audience with, and Timothy as well. Just a short little last word. Jean-Marie.
Just to let you know that I think what we need, and I think it's true everywhere, is national priorities, at least, you know, which can be achieved by different objectives, or no, same objectives, but different methods. And this is where it comes to a political divide. What is this is one. Second thing is that regarding proportional representation, we do have in Rodrigues a local regional assembly, which is elected by a mixed first past the post and proportional representative system, which provides quite a good model of representativity and between popular vote and parliamentary representation. But all governments, during all campaigning for coming to power, we are promised this. And then afterwards, when we come to power, they say, no, this is not the time, we have more priorities, blah, blah, and we'll see it in our next mandate. This is the political mantras. But I think we are coming there. We are coming there, and hopefully my children, and even more, hopefully my grandchildren who live abroad, and part of my children, will see this advancing. And I would be looking from wherever I am, if ever I am somewhere, to see this. I think the younger generation needs to be educated on our history. Technology is a great accelerator. We do not have resources. We have human resources. These human resources are our sole resource, and technology enables us to bridge the gap with our diaspora, which is scattered all over the world, and also all have an interface with international culture. But this doesn't mean, and this is where schizophrenia can be positive, this doesn't mean that we should renounce to our cultural, I say cultural, and maybe more spiritual heritage, which has enabled us to surmount so many obstacles. Yet has been also, we have some backslashes, but we are, I think, quite resilient as parties. But we have to have our political parties do not exist between elections. They are totally undemocratic in their form of representation, but they become challengers to manage and lead our parliamentary democracy, which has flaws.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks. And Timothy, your closing remarks.
I would like, I think the quintessential need that Trinidad has is, in fact, to change the culture, the habits, the values, the attitudes, behaviors. Unless we get that right, we will continue to flounder. And more than anything else, I think that's where our focus should be. So that is not unrelated to your constitution. Think about it. We have in our constitution what our rights and freedoms are, but there's nothing mentioned about duties and responsibilities. What are the civic duties and responsibilities? So we need to really focus on that. I would like to see that in the Constitution, as it is in the Indian Constitution. What do we see as Trinbagonians? What are our core values? I mean, if you recall it at independence, I was a teenager at the time. So I was very much in that mode of having my own independence emerge. So it was a great opportunity. But we had, when the watchwords of discipline, tolerance, and production, excellent stuff was brought up, but they just became words. What should really have happened is in our schooling system in particular, and we did have some of it, civics should be a concentration, and that we develop what common values we all see we need to have. And that's the kind of thing, from my perspective, that will bring people together, that will get us to the critical mass that will allow us to emerge and do better. And I would therefore like to urge that that's a focus that we must have. Changing the economy is the easy part of it.
Agree.
Changing the culture is far more difficult, but far more important.
All right, well, thanks very much. It's been a fascinating and interesting discussion, and it's been a pleasure having you both on the program.
Thank you, Kirk. It was a great pleasure to be here with you.
Well, that's it for this
Namaste.
week's episode.
Thank you. Thank you, Kirk.
You're welcome. That's it for this week's episode of A Story Club Global Politics and Cultures, brought to you by Bulletproof Podcast Formula. We were talking with our guests, Jean-Marie Richard and Timothy Hamel-Smith, on constitutions and elections in multi-ethnic societies, Mauritius and Trinidad and Tobago. I'd also like to thank you, our audience, for watching and listening. Please join us again next week. And in the meanwhile, like, share, follow, subscribe, and tell your friends about us. If you're watching on YouTube, please also click the bell icon so you get notifications of when our programs are uploaded. And thanks again. See you next week.